Have you ever wondered why every society, no matter how different its culture or beliefs, eventually walks through the same financial cycle as if it were following an invisible script? This question becomes even more unsettling when we compare monarchies, dictatorships, and democracies, and realize that all of them, without exception, end up repeating the same six-stage pattern. When you look closely at the great empires of history, from ancient kingdoms to modern superpowers, you start to notice echoes of the same rhythm: the slow birth of centralized power, the tightening grip over currency, the rise of public trust, and eventually the quiet erosion of economic stability. These cycles do not happen randomly. They follow a structure that has appeared across centuries, across continents, and across completely different political systems, suggesting that what we are living through today is not new at all. It is simply our turn in the pattern. Right now, today's society is standing firmly in stage 3 of this financial cycle, a moment often disguised as progress but silently shaped by forces that operate beneath the surface. This stage is built on the expansion of credit, the amplification of public optimism, and the illusion that the system finally works for everyone. It feels stable, safe, predictable, and yet history shows that stage 3 is always the calm before the transformation. Civilizations of the past also believed they had achieved balance until the same economic traps began tightening around them. When we look back at the fall of imperial economies, the consolidation of power under authoritarian regimes, or the quiet restructuring that happens inside democracies, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. And as we start to unpack how this cycle formed and why it always repeats, you may begin to notice that the world you live in is more predictable and more fragile than it appears. You have probably seen signs of this around you, even if you did not name them as part of a cycle. Maybe it was the rising cost of living, changes in political tone, the expansion of centralized economic control, or the shift in public expectations. You may have even felt that something bigger was happening, something you could not quite explain. You are not alone. Many people across different eras felt the same strange sense of transition when their societies passed through this exact stage. What you will uncover throughout this video may reshape the way you interpret headlines, financial decisions, and even daily life, because understanding the cycle means understanding the hidden architecture guiding our present moment. Before we keep moving through this pattern, I would like to know your perspective. Have you ever experienced any signs of this cycle in your own life? Tell me in the comments, let me know what you think, and check if you are already subscribed to the channel. Leave a like to help this investigation reach more people, and stay with me as we open the next layer of this historical and economic story, because what comes next may challenge everything you thought you knew. Long before modern banking systems, credit bubbles, or global markets existed, the foundations of the financial cycle were already forming inside the earliest monarchies. These ancient structures understood something fundamental about human behavior and economic power. When a single authority controlled land, labor, and resources, it inadvertently created the earliest version of centralized finance. Monarchs discovered that controlling grain, metals, and trade routes gave them not only political dominance, but also the ability to shape the entire economic rhythm of their society. This was the first blueprint of the financial cycle, the concentration of wealth at the top, justified through tradition, divinity, or lineage. As kingdoms expanded, so did their need for larger economic systems, leading to the development of early taxation, commodity, storage, and standardized measures of value. These mechanisms were not accidental. They were responses to the same pressures every society faces when it grows beyond its original limits. When these structures became too large, monarchies were forced to innovate. They needed ways to fund wars, manage populations, and stabilize the social hierarchy. This opened the path to the creation of early currencies, minted metals, and controlled trade networks. Once money entered the equation, the cycle accelerated. The concentration of wealth turned into an institutional habit, and because authorities wanted to maintain influence, they shaped the economic environment to preserve order. This included adjusting currency weights, monopolizing resources, and managing the flow of goods. Over time, these actions created predictable patterns: periods of abundance followed by shortages, rapid expansion followed by steep decline. Even without modern economics, monarchies acted in ways that mirrored the same 6 stages societies still experience today. The rise and fall of these ancient systems reveals something vital about financial behavior. Whenever a ruling class secured too much power, economic decisions shifted from serving collective needs to protecting elite interests. This imbalance triggered reactions among the population, leading to moments of unrest, structural reforms, or even collapse. And every time, the monarchy responded by tightening control, issuing new forms of currency, or restructuring debts. These cycles became embedded into the DNA of early civilizations. What seems like distant history actually provides the first evidence that no society escapes this repeating pattern. The roots of our modern stage were planted in these early worlds, where power and currency became inseparable forces shaping the destiny of entire populations. As we follow this thread forward, the transformation from monarchies to more aggressive forms of centralized control begins to reveal deeper layers of the cycle that still influence our world today. As monarchies expanded and their economic structures grew more complex, a new form of governance began to rise, one that tightened control even further and accelerated the financial cycle in ways ancient kings could never imagine. Dictatorships emerged not only from political ambition, but from economic pressure, social instability, and the inevitable consequences of concentrated wealth. When resources became scarce or royal systems could no longer maintain balance, strong central figures stepped in, promising order and efficiency. But this shift was never just political. It represented the next evolution of financial control. Unlike monarchies, which relied on tradition and inherited authority, dictatorships operated through direct force, rapid restructuring, and an aggressive grip on production, currency, and information. This made them extraordinarily effective at shaping economic outcomes in the short term, while laying the groundwork for deeper instability in the long run. At the heart of these authoritarian regimes was the belief that economic chaos required absolute leadership. To achieve this, dictators centralized industry, nationalized key resources, and imposed strict regulations on trade and finance. Currency manipulation became a strategic tool, not merely a response to crisis. Governments redefined the value of money overnight, restricted savings, and enforced mandatory participation in state-controlled economic programs. These decisions were justified as necessary for survival, but they pushed societies deeper into the same cyclical pattern dominance: expansion, strain, and eventual fracture. The population, in turn, became dependent on the promise of stability, even when that stability was built on fragile foundations. The transition from monarchy to dictatorship also introduced a new dynamic: fear as an economic weapon. People behaved differently when every financial choice could attract state scrutiny. Markets became silent spaces where genuine price signals disappeared, replaced by commands from a central authority. This erased the corrective mechanisms that normally prevent economic collapse. And when markets lose the ability to adjust naturally, the cycle accelerates. Shortages become sharper, debts become heavier. The illusion of order becomes harder to maintain. These authoritarian structures created rigid systems that looked strong on the outside but were brittle underneath. The pressure within these economies increased year after year, setting the stage for yet another transformation. Over time, the same societies that embraced authoritarian control eventually sought escape from its restrictions. People demanded participation, rights, and transparency. This desire for freedom opened the path toward democratic systems, but it did not break the cycle. Instead, it reshaped it. The next stage did not eliminate central power, it simply redistributed it and presented it with a different face. The cycle continued its movement forward, adapting to new political landscapes, while preserving the same financial patterns that have echoed across centuries. When democratic systems began to rise, many believed they were finally escaping the rigid economic controls of monarchies and dictatorships. The promise of participation, open markets, and shared decision-making created the impression of stability, progress, and fair distribution of wealth. But beneath this hopeful surface, the same financial cycle continued to operate, simply adapting to a new political structure. Instead of a single authority imposing economic rules, democracies introduced a complex network of institutions, each influencing currency, credit, taxation, and public spending. This created an environment where power was still centralized, but now it was hidden within layers of bureaucracy, financial agencies, and political agreements. The control remained. It was only less visible. As democracies matured, they relied heavily on public trust to maintain economic momentum. Elections reinforced the idea that citizens shaped their financial future, but in reality, the system depended on constant borrowing, expanding credit, and the belief that growth could continue indefinitely. Governments issued bonds, raised budgets, and fueled national optimism through large infrastructure programs and social investments. These actions produced short-term prosperity, but they also pushed societies deeper into the same stage of expansion that had trapped earlier civilizations. People saw rising standards of living, booming markets, and growing opportunities, yet they rarely questioned the structural imbalances forming underneath. Democracies offered a softer narrative, but the mechanics of the cycle remained unchanged. As populations grew and expectations rose, democracies faced an impossible dilemma. To satisfy citizens, they increased public spending. To protect markets, they encouraged the creation of new financial instruments. To maintain confidence, they intervened whenever instability appeared. Each of these decisions reinforced the illusion of stability while creating long-term vulnerabilities. The more democracies tried to balance economic growth with social demands, the more they drifted into the same pattern that defined previous systems' expansion, followed by strain. People felt empowered, but markets became heavily influenced by political considerations, creating delayed consequences that would eventually surface. This illusion of stability is what makes Stage 3 so deceptive. Democracies appear flexible and resilient, yet they often mask the silent buildup of debt, overconfidence, and structural fragility. The past shows that once optimism becomes a strategic tool, societies enter a period where economic reality slowly disconnects from political promises. And this widening gap always leads to the next transformation in the cycle, one that emerges gradually until it becomes impossible to ignore. Before we move forward, I would like to hear something from you. Which part of this democratic illusion resonates most with what you see today? Tell me in the comments so we can explore these patterns together as the narrative deepens. As democracies expanded their financial systems and relied increasingly on credit-driven optimism, a deeper pattern began to resurface, one that has appeared in nearly every major civilization before. Stage 3 is not only a phase of growth and confidence, it is also the moment when societies unknowingly set the conditions for their own transformation. The repetition of this hidden structure explains why empires that never met, cultures that never exchanged ideas, and nations separated by centuries all followed the same six-stage rhythm. What appears to be progress often disguises the early tremors of imbalance. Debt accumulates quietly. Public expectations rise faster than productive capacity. Political promises begin to exceed economic reality. These are not modern inventions. They are echoes of financial behaviors seen in ancient kingdoms, imperial states, and industrial powers alike. When societies reach this stage, people often believe they are living in a uniquely advanced era. They point to technology, global trade, sophisticated institutions, and complex markets as proof that the past cannot repeat itself. Yet these very elements strengthen the underlying cycle. The more interconnected economies become, the more pressure they place on political leaders to maintain the illusion of uninterrupted progress. Governments respond by stimulating consumption, expanding credit, or intervening in markets to protect public confidence. Over time, these actions create asymmetries that are difficult to correct. The system becomes increasingly dependent on continued growth, even when growth is no longer sustainable. This is the moment where the cycle deepens, because societies that rely on optimism as fuel eventually struggle when reality pushes back. Historical records show that once a society enters this stage of expansion, behavioral patterns become strikingly predictable. Households borrow more to match rising costs. Businesses expand, encouraged by easy credit. Markets overvalue assets under the belief that growth will continue indefinitely. Political leaders attempt to satisfy conflicting demands while avoiding unpopular reforms. As these forces collide, a quiet tension forms beneath the surface, usually unnoticed by most people. And yet, this tension is the same warning that appeared in every previous empire before structural change began. It is not a sudden crisis, but a slow drift, a subtle misalignment between what a society expects and what its economic foundations can realistically support. These repeated patterns demonstrate that Stage 3 is never a long-term destination. It is a temporary balance, a fragile midpoint in a much larger cycle. And as the pressures build, societies begin to enter the next layer of transformation, where the collective mindset shifts and the economic narrative becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. The clues of this transition become visible first in behavior, not in statistics, shaping the way people interpret risk, opportunity, and the stability of the system they depend on. As societies settle deeper into Stage 3, the economic and psychological atmosphere begins to shift in subtle but powerful ways. People start to believe that prosperity is a natural state, that markets will always recover, and that governments possess the tools to fix any emerging instability. This collective confidence is not accidental. It is the direct result of years of stimulation, political messaging, and financial structures designed to keep the system expanding. But history shows that this confidence is also one of the most defining characteristics of the cycle at this point. When societies become convinced that their financial environment is predictable, they unconsciously adopt behaviors that make the system increasingly fragile. Daily economic life becomes shaped by optimism. Households stretch budgets under the assumption that future income will rise. Companies take on greater risks, encouraged by previous periods of easy credit and government intervention. Investors focus more on short-term gains than long-term fundamentals, contributing to inflated asset values. Meanwhile, governments continue to expand programs, even when their long-term costs outweigh their immediate benefits. Each of these behaviors reinforces the illusion that the system is stable, while in reality, it is becoming more sensitive to shocks. This is the paradox of stage 3. The stronger the belief in stability, the more unstable the foundation becomes over time. Social behavior also reflects this hidden tension. People begin to divide into groups driven by optimism, frustration, or denial. Some celebrate the apparent success of the current system, pointing to visible signs of progress. Others sense that something is off, but cannot identify the source. This polarization is not new. It has appeared in every society that reached this stage. As expectations rise, institutions face increasing pressure to satisfy demands they cannot fully meet. This leads to policy conflicts, inconsistent decisions, and temporary fixes that add new layers of complexity without resolving underlying issues. These silent fractures form long before the public recognizes them. What makes stage 3 so transformative is that it reshapes the behavior of an entire society from the inside outward. People adjust their spending, their ambitions, their trust in leadership, and their view of the future based on an economic narrative that feels unshakable. But beneath that narrative, financial mechanisms begin drifting out of sync with real productivity, real resources, and real capacity for stability. This widening gap pushes the cycle toward its next turning point, where familiar signs appear not as sudden crises, but as gradual shifts in perception and policy that signal deeper changes ahead. As the financial cycle moves further through stage 3, one of the most revealing elements is how manipulation blends seamlessly into everyday life. It rarely appears as an explicit command or a visible shift in power. Instead, it hides within economic narratives, public announcements, institutional decisions, and small policy adjustments that seem harmless at first glance. These signals are subtle enough that most people overlook them, yet consistent enough that anyone studying historical cycles can immediately recognize the pattern. When optimism becomes a strategic tool rather than a natural sentiment, societies begin to experience changes in tone rather than changes in law, and this is often where manipulation takes root. Leaders emphasize stability while quietly adjusting the mechanisms that maintain it. Financial institutions promote confidence even as they prepare for volatility. Markets appear calm on the surface while internal pressure grows. These signals have appeared countless times throughout history. You can see them in the final decades of ancient empires, in the late stages of monarchies, and in the final expansions of industrial powers. They include controlled messaging about economic strength, artificially low interest rates, sudden increases in public spending, or rapid interventions designed to preserve the appearance of balance. The public rarely sees these choices as warning signs because they are presented as solutions, not symptoms. The manipulation becomes effective precisely because it is subtle. People continue with their routines while the structure beneath them shifts gradually, quietly, predictably. The most powerful part of this stage is how perception is shaped. Societies begin to accept narratives that downplay risk, suppress concerns, or reinterpret instability as temporary noise. This psychological management is not new. It has been used in every era where leaders sought to maintain confidence despite growing internal strain. The more fragile the system becomes, the more persuasive the messaging must be. This is why, during stage 3, institutions emphasize unity, resilience, or long-term potential. These ideas are not inherently false, but they are strategically amplified to guide public behavior. Manipulation at Dawara. This stage is not designed to deceive maliciously, but to preserve order, even when the underlying mechanisms are no longer aligned with reality. As these subtle signals accumulate, individuals who pay attention begin to sense a shift in the atmosphere. They feel that something is not matching the narrative they are being shown, but they cannot always identify the source. This feeling has echoed through generations. People living in past civilizations experienced the same quiet tension during periods of controlled messaging and economic imbalance. History shows that societies rarely recognize the turning point while they are in it. Instead, they notice adjustments in tone, in expectations, in the way leaders speak about the future. These changes do not mark the end of a cycle. They mark the approach of the next transformation, one that becomes clearer as we continue moving through this unfolding pattern. Before we continue, I would like to hear from you. Which subtle signal do you notice most in today's society? Share your perspective in the comments so we can explore how these patterns appear in real life. Beneath the visible actions of governments and institutions, a deeper network of financial mechanisms continues to operate quietly, shaping the direction of entire societies. These hidden structures do not rely on public messaging or political narratives. Instead, they function through complex interactions between global markets, international agreements, central banks, and private financial entities that move capital across borders with remarkable speed. This underlying machinery becomes especially active during stage 3, when the surface narrative of stability masks the growing internal tensions. While the public focuses on elections, policies, or short-term economic news, The real drivers of the cycle are often decisions made in boardrooms, international forums, and institutional corridors that rarely reach mainstream attention. Global finance acts like a circulatory system connecting every major economy. When one region faces pressure, capital moves to another. When instability appears, investors reposition assets, triggering cascading effects that influence currencies, interest rates, and national budgets. These shifts can appear sudden, but they usually originate from slow, methodical adjustments that began long before the public noticed any change. During stage 3, these movements become more frequent because large institutions prepare for potential disruptions even while governments reinforce narratives of stability. This divergence between what is said and what is being done reveals that the remaining stages of the cycle are approaching, driven not by public opinion but by structural forces that have been building for years. Another key factor lies in the way global institutions respond to early stress signals. Central banks coordinate monetary decisions that affect millions of lives, yet the rationale behind these decisions is often expressed in neutral, technical language that hides the magnitude of their impact. Adjustments in interest rates, liquidity injections, or currency interventions are presented as routine, while in reality they reflect the system's struggle to maintain balance. Financial entities with access to this information adapt long before the broader market does, creating a gap in understanding that amplifies inequality and accelerates the cycle. These dynamics have appeared repeatedly in historical transitions, from the end of imperial trading networks to the restructuring of industrial economies in the 20th century. What makes these global movements so influential is that they operate independently of political debates or public expectations. They follow the logic of capital, efficiency, and risk management, not the rhythm of democratic promises or ideological narratives. As these forces intensify, societies begin to feel the effects indirectly through changing prices, investment patterns, and employment shifts, even without realizing the connection. This quiet transformation signals that the final layers of stage 3 are unfolding. And as these structural pressures rise, the cycle moves closer to its next phase, where consequences that once seemed distant start to shape reality in ways that can no longer be overlooked. As the hidden mechanisms of global finance intensify their movements, the effects begin to ripple through everyday life in ways that feel gradual at first, but become increasingly difficult to ignore. Societies in stage 3 often experience these shifts as isolated events, rising costs here, shrinking opportunities there, a sudden change in market behavior, or a noticeable shift in public mood. Yet none of these signals occur randomly. They are the natural outcome of the pressure that has been building for years beneath the surface. When the structural imbalance between optimism and underlying reality becomes too wide, the system starts adjusting. Itself often quietly at first, but with growing force over time. Households tighten budgets, businesses delay investments, governments face fiscal constraints they can no longer disguise. These early consequences do not strike all at once, but their pattern is unmistakable to anyone who has studied previous cycles. The key feature of this stage is how deeply interconnected everything becomes. A small disruption in one sector cascades into other areas, revealing the fragility that had been hidden behind narratives of stability. A shift in commodity prices can trigger changes in global supply chains. A decline in public confidence can alter market behavior. A single policy decision can unsettle international partners. This interconnected fragility mirrors the closing chapters of many civilizations throughout history, where late-stage expansion began to collide with the limits of available resources, political cohesion, and long-term sustainability. The consequences feel new to the people living through them, but they are reflections of transitions witnessed repeatedly across centuries. At this point in the cycle, a psychological shift also takes place. The general sentiment moves from unquestioned optimism to cautious uncertainty. People begin to sense that the world around them is not functioning the way it used to, even if no major crisis has occurred yet. This creates an atmosphere of silent tension where expectations gradually adjust and collective behavior begins to change. Leaders attempt to reassure the public, institutions try to maintain confidence, and markets oscillate between stability and volatility. But these reactions are signs of pressure, not resilience. History shows that once a society enters this phase, the underlying forces driving the cycle gain momentum, pushing the system closer to the threshold where adjustments are no longer optional but inevitable. These consequences do not signal collapse. They signal transition. Every empire, monarchy, dictatorship, and democracy experienced similar moments as they moved from one stage of the cycle to the next. What distinguishes this moment is the scale and speed at which modern societies operate. Information travels instantly. Markets react in seconds. Policies shift rapidly to manage unfolding pressures. All of this accelerates the movement toward stage 4. where the forces that have been quietly building finally begin to reshape the structure of society in visible, undeniable ways. As the financial cycle approaches the transition from stage 3 to stage 4, the shift becomes impossible to ignore. What once appeared as isolated tensions now begins to take shape as a clearer pattern, revealing the structural forces that have been building beneath society for years. Stage 4 is not a sudden break, but a gradual unveiling, a moment when the weight of accumulated expectations meets the limits of economic reality. Throughout history, this stage has marked the turning point, where societies confront the consequences of long periods of expansion, optimism, and centralized control. The narrative of stability weakens, institutions face mounting pressure, and political debates intensify as the system tries to adjust to forces it can no longer fully contain. People sense the change not through dramatic events, but through a subtle shift in atmosphere, as if the ground beneath them is slowly realigning. During this period, governments and financial institutions attempt to manage the transition with strategic interventions. They may restructure debts, adjust policies, or introduce new economic frameworks to delay or soften the impact. Yet these actions often highlight the underlying strain rather than resolve it. Markets become more sensitive to disruption. Public confidence wavers in cycles of hope and concern. Social divisions widen as different groups interpret the unfolding changes through their own experiences. These reactions mirror the movements seen in previous civilizations when they crossed this threshold, from the final decades of ancient empires to the later stages of industrial dominance. The patterns repeat because the pressures driving them are rooted in human behavior, collective expectations, and the limits of economic systems that expand faster than they can sustain. The movement into stage 4 also exposes the deeper reality that societies rarely recognize the turning point until they are already well within it. Individuals experience the transition through personal decisions, tightening budgets, reassessing risk, reconsidering investments, or questioning long-standing assumptions about growth and stability. These subtle shifts accumulate until the broader structure begins responding in visible ways. Policies change more frequently. Economic forecasts become more cautious. Institutions emphasize resilience rather than expansion. Each of these adjustments reflects the system's attempt to rebalance itself as the next stage unfolds. Understanding this moment provides a powerful lens not only for interpreting the present, but for anticipating what comes after. The years ahead will be shaped by how societies respond to these pressures, whether through adaptation, restructuring, or resistance. And while the future remains unwritten, the cycle offers a framework for recognizing the signals that guide this transformation, allowing those who pay attention to navigate uncertainty with greater clarity and awareness. If you stayed with me until this point, I would like to hear from you. Leave a comment saying something like, "I am here until the end," or "This message was for me," so I know you followed this entire journey. If this content helped you see today's world with more clarity, consider subscribing to the channel so you do not miss the next chapters of this analysis. A like also helps this discussion reach more people who are trying to understand these unfolding shifts. And if you want to continue exploring this topic, there's another video here that connects naturally with what we just uncovered. Click and continue this investigation with me.